Good morning, everyone. My name is Rebecca Lucero, and I am the Commissioner for the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. I am joined by Deputy Commissioner Irina Vaynerman, who will help answer any questions you may have. The Minnesota Department of Human Rights is the state's civil rights enforcement agency. We are charged with upholding the civil rights of Minnesotans under the Minnesota Human Rights Act. Or practice of race discrimination. What are the findings of this investigation, and lay out next steps, which is to negotiate a consent decree with the city. I want to start out by talking about the temporary court order that the Minnesota Department of Human Rights obtained within a week of announcing this investigation, which resulted in early and significant public safety changes in Minneapolis. One clear example was the requirement that the city implement a policy banning all chokeholds and neck restraints without exception. Another example is that at the time the court order was entered, at least 65 completed police misconduct cases were sitting on the police chief's desk awaiting review. At least 4 of those were over 200 days old. After the temporary court order was implemented, the police chief quickly moved on this backlog, and final discipline decisions are public on MPD's website for the first time. As part of the temporary court order, the city and MPD were required to make these changes directly into their policies. This ensures that they stay in effect even after this investigation ends. What has taken other cities years to implement, we did in the first week of this investigation. And that was just the first week. It's been nearly 2 years, so let me talk about what we've been doing since then and the investigation itself. The team of investigators conducted a comprehensive investigation that looked at the city of Minneapolis and the Minneapolis Police Department over the past 10 years. You'll see here ride-alongs and interviews with many MPD officers occurring in every precinct, in person, all during the height of COVID. We owe the rank and file of the MPD a lot of gratitude for their forthcoming and honest feedback. We heard recurring themes about the need for tools, resources, and strong leadership that is essential for success. You'll see here that the team of investigators watched approximately 700 hours of body-worn camera footage. They observed 87 hours of academy training and they reviewed 480,000 pages of city and MPD documents, such as training materials, policies, assessments, emails, social media, and discipline records. I specifically want to hold space for the over 2,200 community members who we interviewed or provided reports to our agency about their experiences, as well as the 15 listening sessions, including many hosted by organizations and neighborhood associations across Minneapolis. I want to thank every community member who shared their experience with investigators throughout this investigation. The Minnesota Department of Human Rights also worked with nationally recognized policing experts to complete this investigation. This included policing practice experts at 21CP, many of whom formerly served as police chiefs across the country. We also worked with a renowned policing statistician and professor of criminology, Greg Ridgway, at the University of Pennsylvania, where he is chair of the Department of Criminology. This investigation would not have been possible without a team of lawyers and staff from Kirkland and Ellis, which provided a tremendous amount of pro bono support. This included support from Lisa Madigan, the former Illinois Attorney General, currently a partner at Kirkland and Ellis. I really want to thank everyone who supported this investigation to make sure that we got it right. So what are the findings? After completing this extensive investigation, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights finds that the city and Minneapolis Police Department engaged in a pattern or practice of race discrimination in violation of the Minnesota Human Rights Act. Throughout this investigation, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights determined that this pattern of race-based policing is caused primarily by an organizational culture that can be described in three ways. First, flawed training, which emphasized a paramilitary approach to policing. Second, deficient accountability systems that are designed to not hold officers accountable for misconduct and therefore fail to hold officers accountable for misconduct. And lastly, former and current city and MPD leaders who have not collectively acted with the urgency, coordination, and intentionality necessary to address racial disparities in policing, to improve public safety, and increase community trust. I will come back to each of these with more detail later in the presentation. But let me move on now to discuss where we find this pattern or practice of race discrimination. We found a pattern of practice in race discrimination, first, in racial disparities, in how MPD officers use force and conduct traffic stops against people of color, particularly Black community members, compared to white community members in similar circumstances. We found a pattern of race discrimination and race-based policing in how MPD officers use covert social media to surveil or falsely engage with Black leaders, Black organizations, and government officials unrelated to criminal activity. We also see MPD's officers' consistent use of racist, misogynistic, and otherwise disrespectful language. Let's start by digging into this first one, racial disparities in how MPD officers use force and conduct traffic stops against people of color, particularly Black community members. In the investigation, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights looks at when MPD officers use force. Now, every police department uses force, but officers should not use more severe force against Black people. In fact, it's discriminatory and unlawful to do so. And our findings show that in Minneapolis, MPD officers use more severe force against Black people than white people do in similar circumstances. And we specifically look at neck restraints and chemical irritants when we looked at use of force. And here we found MPD officers are more likely to use neck restraints against Black community members compared to white community members in similar circumstances. We also found that MPD officers are more likely to use chemical irritants against Black community members compared to white community members in similar circumstances. Next, we looked at traffic stops. And we analyzed traffic stops because they are one of the most common ways that MPD officers and community members interact. And if you were pulled over by an MPD officer from January of 2017 through 2020, then your stop is reflected in this data around traffic stops. Here we found that MPD officers are more likely to stop vehicles with people of color and Indigenous individuals, and they treat Black and white individuals differently once they have pulled someone over. So let's start by looking at the decision to make the stop itself. MPD's data shows that MPD officers are more likely to stop a car with people of color and Indigenous community members when their race is visible during daylight hours compared to when it is dark outside. Okay, so why is this important? Why does it matter that we look at daylight versus night? It matters because during daylight hours, it is more possible to see someone's race or ethnicity. So when an MPD officer has the potential to see the race of the people in the car because it's daylight, they are more likely to choose to stop a car that has a person of color or an Indigenous community member in it compared to when it is dark outside and the race of the people in the vehicle is less visible. Now, importantly, this racial disparity in traffic stops exists across Minneapolis. It's not the result of traffic enforcement practices in a single precinct. So none of this can be explained or excused away by one precinct. Let's look next at what happens after an officer decides to stop a vehicle. Now, MPD's data shows that officers are more likely to stop Black community members for longer. They're more likely to search Black community members or their vehicles. They're more likely to cite Black community members, use force against Black community members, and arrest Black community members during a traffic stop. And this is when compared to white community members in similar circumstances. And that's important, that similar circumstances thing, and I'm going to go back to that here in a second. But let me just note real quick that MPD's data does not contain sufficient information for a similar analysis for Latino, Asian, Indigenous, or other racial groups for this specific type of analysis. However, MPD does have data to analyze looking at Black individuals, and here you see this pattern of race-based policing occurring across the board. Again, we found these patterns throughout the city. So none of this can be explained or excused away by one precinct. So I mentioned similar circumstances, and so I want to take a minute here to talk about the methodology behind this analysis because it's important. How did we determine that race is the likely reason for this difference? Since Black individuals comprise approximately 19% of the Minneapolis population, anything over 19% of all searches conducted by MPD officers of Black individuals would be disproportionate, a proportionality analysis. Here you see that analysis. From January 1, 2017 to May 24, 2020, MPD's data shows that 78% of all searches conducted by MPD officers were searches of Black individuals or their vehicles in MPD's 5 precincts across Minneapolis. Now, despite the substantial disproportionality of searches that you see here, some city MPD leaders and some MPD officers will say that this disproportionality is due to factors other than race. As an example, someone may explain that MPD officers patrol parts of the city that have more crime, so geography is the primary reason for this disparity. So to consider this, we did additional analysis that looked at what happens when MPD officers and Black community members are in similar circumstances, and what happens when MPD officers and white community members are engaged in similar circumstances to see if they're treated the same or differently in those circumstances. This is really an apples to apples analysis. We're really looking at the same and similar circumstances to make sure that we can compare it. And what we see here and so the way we accounted for this analysis and the way we did this is we controlled for and we accounted for factors. So we controlled for geographic location. We controlled for the year, the month, the day, even the time of day. So those cannot be the explanations, nor can they be the excuses for race disparities. This means that where there is a difference, race is the likely reason for this difference. And you see, when comparing Black and white community members in similar circumstances, MPD officers are almost 2 times as likely to search Black community members or their vehicles. Let's next move to use of covert social media. Now, law enforcement officers may have legitimate reasons to track social media activity. Police departments may specifically have a reason to use covert social media if there is a clear investigative purpose to advance public safety. However, a review of MPD's covert social media accounts from at least January 2010 through December 2020 demonstrates that MPD officers used covert or fake social media accounts to surveil and engage Black individuals, Black organizations, and elected officials unrelated to criminal activity. So there's no public safety objective. Okay, so what is a covert account? It's an account where an MPD officer is using MPD social media account. They are using a fake name, a fake picture, and are presenting as someone that is different than who they really are, so not an MPD police officer. Here, our focus was on MPD officers using MPD covert social media accounts unrelated to criminal activity. So let's talk about that. In one post, an MPD officer used a covert account to pose as a Black community member to send a message to a local branch of the NAACP criticizing the group. MPD officers also used MPD's covert social accounts to send private messages criticizing elected officials. They did this while posing as community members. Now, police officers using covert social media to contact and criticize elected officials can really undermine the democratic process because false communications can distort elected officials' perspectives of positions taken by community members. And you'll see in our findings that we talk about how police officers can use covert social media when they're doing so for a clear investigative purpose to advance public safety. And police departments that use covert social media must have clear procedures and clear accountability mechanisms in place to ensure that covert social media has a close nexus to a true public safety objective and that it's not being used in a discriminatory manner. It is not the case here. According to, let's last look at where MPD officers engage in a pattern of race discrimination through racist, misogynistic, and disrespectful language. And here we looked at body-worn camera footage, discipline records, statements from community members, interviews with MPD officers and prosecutors, and we found that some MPD officers and supervisors use racist, misogynistic, disrespectful, and offensive language. And they use this language to everyone, to criminal suspects, to witnesses, to bystanders, and to fellow MPD and city officials themselves. City employees. In a second, we're going to return to the slides about how this pattern of race discrimination is caused by organizational culture. We'll talk about how this is because it is created and demonstrated through consistent behavior. Organizational culture is created and demonstrated through consistent behavior. And MPD maintains an organizational culture where officers consistently use racist, misogynistic, and disrespectful language. Furthermore, MPD does not uniformly and consistently hold officers accountable for using this language. This consistent behavior manifests and reinforces this kind of organizational culture. So let's go back to the slide here that talked about this pattern of race-based policing being caused by an organizational culture and start with trainings. Now, MPD's data shows that MPD officers are using unnecessary and excessive force, that they are escalating situations instead of de-escalating situations, and that there is race-based policing occurring. So it is not surprising that trainings are infused with a paramilitary approach and that warrior mindset given this data. Now, although the city formally banned official warrior-style training in 2019, much of MPD's current trainings continue to embed this warrior mindset in its officers. On the very first day of academy training in 2021, police recruits were told instant and unquestioned compliance is an order. This mentality of unquestioned obedience is endemic within MPD's organizational culture and undermines MPD's written policies. For example, if the written policy is that an officer has the duty to intervene when they see unlawful use of force occurring, the actual policy of instant and unquestioned compliance undermines the existence of that written duty to intervene policy, rendering it useless. This instant and unquestioned compliance is also the same tone that many MPD officers set with community members, which sets up a real us versus them dynamic with community members that they are sworn to serve and protect. MPD also fails to provide comprehensive cultural competency training for officers. In fact, when MPD shortened its 2021 Academy training session, MPD eliminated conversations about practicing cultural competency when working with specific groups of color and Indigenous community members. In a city with such racial and ethnic diversity, the choice to eliminate these trainings is concerning. This decision also occurred after the city was under investigation by both the state and federal government for potential race discrimination within the MPD. So the decision to eliminate these trainings then was frankly surprising. Now, trainings are important because they are where the culture of MPD is taught. They're where culture norms are reinforced. They're where MPD officers learn what happens if they violate these culture norms. And here, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights found that MPD's trainings reinforce a culture that exacerbates a pattern of race-based policing. Next, let's talk about flawed accountability systems. I'm going to start by first talking about supervisors tacitly or directly approving inappropriate and potentially unlawful behavior, because supervision and supervisors is the first line of accountability long before you move into any more formal sort of accountability systems. So I want to give you an example that's illustrative of this pattern of supervisors approving inappropriate and potential unlawful behavior. So in one example, an MPD officer came into a bedroom to find an unarmed black 14-year-old sitting on the floor using his phone. The MPD officer demanded the kid stand up, but the kid did not stand up fast enough for the officer. All of this was happening very quickly. The MPD officer took out his flashlight and hit the 14-year-old kid across his head with the flashlight, causing the kid to bleed out of his ear right here. Next, the officer grabbed the kid by the neck and did what's called an unconscious neck restraint, which, as the name suggests, means the MPD officer choked the kid until he was unconscious. Following this incident, the supervisor reviewed the file, and the supervisor approved this use of force and said there was no violation of policy or law. By deeming this officer's use of force appropriate, the supervisor effectively authorized the officer to continue using such egregious force in the future. Then, if an investigation were to occur, and in the example I just highlighted, no timely investigation occurred, but if one were to occur, investigators regularly fail to properly investigate a significant percentage of police misconduct cases. This includes misconduct cases where there may be problems with race discrimination. Next, MPD fails to consistently hold officers accountable. For instance, if an investigation does occur, oftentimes officers are supposed to receive coaching. This isn't discipline, but coaching. And the investigation found that 37% of the time officers were supposed to receive coaching, the supervisors simply did not coach that officer. That means the officers did not get the support, they did not get the resources, and they did not get the training that they clearly needed to be successful. This means that in these moments when supervisors are failing to provide this coaching, the supervisors are setting the officers up for continued failure. Finally, when discipline decisions go to arbitration, and it's rare, it's a little bit over 20 in the last 10 years for discipline decisions, they are often reduced to preventable factors within the city and MPD's control. One arbitration case particularly demonstrates how factors within the city and MPD's control impact arbitration outcomes. In a case from 2019, an arbitrator reduced a termination decision to an 80-hour suspension. In this situation, an officer had potentially used excessive force when making an arrest. Here, the city and MPD did the right thing, and they relieved the officer of duty, requiring the officer to stay home before eventually assigning the officer to a desk position with no contact with the public, and initiated an investigation. The investigation resulted in a recommended finding that the officer had, in fact, used excessive force. However, the day after the finding was issued, an MPD leader decided to send the officer back to regular duty with full enforcement responsibilities, then further relied on that officer as a field training officer to train other officers. Subsequently, it took over a year for the city and MPD to ultimately terminate this officer. So when the arbitrator looked at this case, the arbitrator overturned the decision to terminate because, in large part, of the decisions of MPD to return the MPD officer to regular duty, including field training, to do so after a recommended finding of excessive force had come out, and that it took an additional year for the officer to be terminated. This example highlights the factors that are fully within the control and of the city and MPD to prevent reduction in arbitrations. Importantly, community members of color and Indigenous individuals especially experience the ramifications of the failure of these accountability systems to address race-based policing. Lastly, let's talk about this pattern of race-based policing being caused by an organizational culture of a lack of collective action by city and MPD leadership. Now, another way we can understand culture is by looking at leadership and seeing what they say and what they do. As a result of a lack of coordinated and sustained action to address racial disparities in policing, city and MPD leaders throughout at least the past decade have allowed MPD to maintain an organizational culture that demands unquestionable compliance, emboldens aggressive escalation, and is adverse to accountability. Leadership is critical. Leadership is critical to bringing about organizational change and address race-based policing. Throughout our investigation, former and current city and MPD leaders all acknowledged that there is a problem with MPD's organizational culture and that they knew that it was resulting in racial disparities. And yet, over the 10 years that our investigation looked at, let me clarify, over the 10 years that our investigation looked at, there certainly have been instances where both city and MPD leaders have acted. For instance, Minneapolis band warrior style training, that's something that I mentioned earlier in this presentation. Yet in some cases where city and MPD leaders attempted to implement change, current and former city and MPD leaders have not collectively acted with the necessary urgency, coordination, and intentionality that is required to create and maintain a strong public safety system, which includes eliminating discriminatory policing. Furthermore, in some cases where city and MPD leaders attempted to make changes, those attempted changes were eroded by city and MPD leaders providing inaccurate or misleading information to the public. When city and MPD leaders provide inaccurate or confusing information, it sows distrust, it amplifies that confusion, and it undermines meaningful attempts at change. So leadership is critical. And our investigation identified that there has been a vacuum of collective action, of collective sustained action from key city and MPD leaders. And the organizational culture at MPD has existed unchecked for resulting in unlawful discriminatory policing. It undermines public safety, and it's been going on for at least the past decade. This brings me to the last finding that you'll see on page 8 of the determination, if you're following along. And this is that the investigation finds that without fundamental organizational culture change, reforming MPD's policies, procedures, and trainings will be meaningless. This is a big statement, but I think it speaks to the scope of the challenge that lies ahead. So let's discuss what's next. So this process does not start and it does not end with these findings. The city has made and continues to make efforts to address these concerns, and as we note throughout the determination, the city can make immediate changes that are fully within the control of the city and MPD that do not require modifications to any collective bargaining agreement or state law. Now, Minnesota Department of Human Rights will next work with the city to develop a consent decree to address this discriminatory race-based policing in Minneapolis in violation of the Minnesota Human Rights Act. Now, a consent decree with the city of Minneapolis and the Minneapolis Police Department is really unprecedented. Unlike previous events to reform policing in Minneapolis, a consent decree is a legally binding agreement that the parties are required by law to follow. A consent decree lays out specific changes that the city and MPD will be required to make to address the pattern of race discrimination in violation of the Minnesota Human Rights Act. Because a consent decree is issued by a judge, it is the judge who holds parties accountable, with monitors that report the progress directly to the judge. Importantly, a consent decree also lives on past all election cycles, which provides for that sustained action that is necessary here for success. And so it's not subject to the whims of changing elected officials. A consent decree is also a tool. A tool can be very powerful, but it is only a tool, which is why we want to be just as thoughtful in this next phase to get this right. To that end, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights will meet with community members, MPD officers, city staff, and other stakeholders to gather feedback on what should be included in a consent decree to address the race-based policing we have noted throughout our findings here. Anyone is welcome to send information for potential changes in a consent decree by going to the website. It's listed here at mn.gov/MDHR. And we'll continue with additional information in the coming weeks about that engagement. I started this presentation by talking about how, following the murder of George Floyd, demands to end discriminatory policing practices reverberated across the world. Those demands remain just as true and urgent today with this announcement of the investigative findings, which paints an unsettling picture of the city of Minneapolis and the Minneapolis Police Department engaging in a pattern of racial discrimination over the last decade. Now, race-based policing is unlawful, and it harms everyone, especially people of color and Indigenous community members, sometimes costing community members their lives. I look forward to the work ahead with the city, with MPD, with community members to improve public safety by reversing unlawful discriminatory policing practices in violation of the Minnesota Human Rights Act. Thank you very much. We can open it up to any questions.
Commissioner, how critical was body-worn camera footage to this investigation? What would this have been like if you weren't able to see and hear what officers were doing in terms of their interactions with the community?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Body-worn camera footage was one part of the many pieces that we looked at as part of this comprehensive investigation. So we noted that we watched approximately 700 hours of body-worn camera footage. It was a significant amount of body-worn camera footage we watched, and it was just one part of a big part of a comprehensive investigation.
How many consent decrees has the department?
That's a good question. Consent decrees are tools that we have used. I don't have a specific number off the top of my head, but we have used consent decrees as an enforcement mechanism multiple times.
How forthcoming were people in the community when you interviewed them? Were they very truthful? Were they remorseful? Kind of explain how that impact of what MPD officers did to the community members, and were they open with you about it?
Yeah, thank you for that question. We heard from over 2,200 community members who we interviewed or provided reports to our agency during these experiences. We also hosted multiple listening sessions. Obviously, it was very important to hear directly from community members about their experiences, who talked about their experiences over a substantial amount of time, not just the last few years, not just the last decade. And I really do want to thank every community member who shared their experience with investigators throughout this investigation process.
Commissioner Lucero, can you talk a little bit about how this either overlaps or impacts the federal Department of Justice investigation that's going on into the Minneapolis Police Department?
Absolutely. So this is an independent investigation looking at whether or not there is a violation of the Minnesota Human Rights Act. The Department of Justice is an independent investigation looking at federal law. So this is just about the Minnesota Human Rights Act.
So is it possible then to have multiple consent decrees against the Minneapolis Police Department being enforced at the same time if the feds come down with similar results in their investigation?
It is possible to have multiple consent decrees against any entity at any point in time. I'm not sure where this will take us next.
Do you need cooperation from the mayor and council to do a consent decree? And if so, have they told you whether they're open to this?
Can you start that question again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, do you need cooperation from the mayor and council to do a consent decree? And if so, have they said whether they're open to this?
We had an opportunity to meet with the mayor and his team this morning. It was a productive conversation, and they were reviewing this for the first time this morning themselves. So it'll be one of many conversations with them in the coming days and weeks ahead.
Can you break down, maybe you did this already, how many officers you spoke with, both rank and file as well as command staff? And the second part of my question is, how forthcoming would you say they were in your conversations with them, your investigators' conversations with them? I mean, were they cooperative and expressive of any openness to change?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to start with the second question there for you. So we met one-on-one with officers in every precinct. They did not have to meet with investigators. It was their choice to meet with investigators. And overwhelmingly, we found officers being very forthcoming in their conversations with investigators throughout the process. We spoke to everyone at every level, and I'm going to turn to Deputy Commissioner Vaynerman to expand a little bit.
Yeah, as the commissioner stated, we met with officers of all ranks across all 5 precincts and in all of the specialty teams as well, in addition to command staff and of course police chiefs, that span the decade of time that we reviewed.
And I know it's probably in here, but about how many officers was that?
We don't have the precise number in the findings themselves, but dozens and dozens, and enough to get a sense of the pattern and themes that arise across every precinct.
Was there a number of black officers that you talked to, and did any of those talk about discriminations that they faced even beyond the 10 years that you guys looked into?
So we were able to connect with officers of all racial and ethnic backgrounds, and across the board, officers were very forthcoming and forthright about their experiences, both policing in community and experiences within the police department. And you'll see there's a specific section with respect to the racist and misogynistic language that the commissioner spoke about that is a component of our findings here, in which officers themselves speak about the way in which they were treated by other MPD officers, officers of color in particular, who shared those experiences.
I couldn't help but the language on page 38 of this report where you talk about the racism and misogyny and some of really the worst words in the English language you have laid out in this report. Do you know, after reviewing that body camera footage, were any of those officers who spoke that way about community members disciplined in any way?
Thank you for that question. So one of the things that we clarify is that officers are inconsistently disciplined for this kind of language, racist, misogynistic, and disrespectful language. And with that inconsistency leads to this kind of culture where this is manifested and reinforced in many ways. But I think that this language is just a piece of an indication of a much bigger pattern of the systems that are going on here that would allow this to happen.
Do you know?
Can I just jump in here? Paul Bloom with Fox 9. I appreciate you taking our questions today. First, about leadership. I know you met with the mayor's office. This might be a little too political for you to answer specifically, but that department is currently being run, correct, by an interim chief that's come up through the ranks. Do you have confidence that the leadership is in place to make the changes that the Department of Human Rights feels are necessary? And then on top of that, a second question would just be, in the aftermath of George Floyd, right, that department has been ravaged by the losses of huge numbers of police officers. I'm just wondering if you feel their hands are tied right now in terms of staffing, in terms of discipline. How can they make some of these changes when they can basically only play the cards they're dealt? And right now those cards are light in numbers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So to your first question, it took a lot of people to get to this place over a lot of period of time. It's going to take a lot of work by a lot of people to get out of this. And so it's not about one person that we're going to need to get out of this. This is an opportunity, though, as we're looking for a new police chief, to see this kind of, to look for this kind of leadership that's really necessary to provide that sustained oversight. To your second question, we absolutely can do this, and we must do this. And I think that that is why a consent decree to move forward on this provides that kind of structure that's necessary, because it provides clear guidelines and accountability structures throughout over time to make sure that it happens and that it doesn't get lost as election cycles move us forward.
Commissioner Lucero, many times reports like this focus so much on the data gathering. How important was it for your office to include these specific anecdotes with the officers' names removed for the public to read about these specific instances and detailed stops, detailed instances of use of force?
Yeah, thank you for the question. The data is really important. It tells a story, and we've talked through how we made the decision, or we went through that to determine that race is the likely reason for these differences. Where we provide examples, it's illustrative of where that data exists, so it brings that data to life in many ways.
Were you able to determine how many of the officers who engaged in problematic behavior are
Yeah, thank you for that. So our investigation was really focused on whether or not there was a pattern or practice of race discrimination over time. And so our findings show that there are. It wasn't about any specific officer. So we don't have any information for you about any specific officer being there or not being there.
Can you speak to any of the timeline here and when some of these changes might need to be made and any immediate next steps that can be put in place?
Sure, thank you very much. So when it comes to the next steps that we're talking about with negotiating a consent decree because there's violations of the Minnesota Human Rights Act, we obviously want to work with urgency because this is something that is very important to the citizens of Minneapolis, and we want to make sure we get it right. So we want to take our time to be talking to community members, MPD officers. We are working with 21 CP, who are a lot of former police chiefs who will be meeting with MPD officers directly. We're also working with Minnesota Justice Research Center that will be putting together and is putting together a comprehensive community engagement process. And so we want to get that part done, and then we'll be working with the city to negotiate the consent decree in violations of the Minnesota Human Rights Act.
On that note, what sort of resource, over here, sorry.
Thank you.
Sort of, no problem. What sort of resources, ongoing resources from the State Department of Human Rights are going to be part of this consent decree? The independent monitor you mentioned, is that a state staffer? Is that someone completely outside of it? And does your office have the capacity to continue this long term?
Thank you for that. So the consent decree process, I'm going to turn to Irina Vaynerman, Deputy Commissioner, sorry, to talk through a little more.
Yeah, so the question with respect to who would serve as a monitor, that's a separate person or usually a separate team of people, not state employees, that the court then works with directly to ensure that the components of the consent decree are effectuated, that the changes that we agree to actually happen on the timelines and timeframes that are set within the consent decree.
So that would be then, sorry, so that would be then a contract essentially, like the state would enter a contract with that independent monitor?
It's different. This gets a little bit wonky on the legal side, but it's not necessarily a contract because the monitors work directly with the court and report directly to the court, and the parties, both the state and the city of Minneapolis, would be working directly with that monitor as well.
And they then would they be financially, who's I guess financially on the hook for the oversight?
So the way in which monitors work in jurisdictions across the country is that the city would be responsible for paying for the cost of the monitors.
And how long do you envision this consent decree being in place? Any idea at this point?
Yeah, that's a good question. As we talked about, there's some real need for some organizational change. That does not happen overnight. It's not as easy as a policy fix. So we want to make sure we get it done correctly. So as long as it takes to do it right.
You said that there were some Black elected officials targeted by police using fake social media accounts. Can you say who those were? And not any other elected, they were targeting Black elected officials?
Thank you for that question to allow me to clarify that the statement was that they are targeting elected officials, period. We did not identify the race of those elected officials, and we're not providing any specific names of those elected officials.
And have any of the officers, to your knowledge, been disciplined as a result of this investigation or put on leave? You don't have to get into specific names, but.
Right. So this was an investigation looking at the pattern or practice, so we weren't looking at any individual, any specific individual to track through, so I don't have that information for you at this time.
If you were to pinpoint just a few areas, I mean, we hear the union's the problem, the state needs to change laws, the council needs to do this, then, you know, there's always a roadblock, it seems. What would you identify as the crux of the problem with the Minneapolis Police Department, if you could, like, you know, distill it down?
Sure. Sure. Well, I think that I distilled it down nicely on those slides for you that talked about the pattern is caused by an organizational culture of flawed training, deficient accountability systems, and a lack of collective action by city and MPD leadership. But what I want to stress is that all of these are fully within the control of the city and MPD and don't require any change to state, federal law, or collective bargaining agreements. And we lay that out throughout the findings.
These results are coming out while Minneapolis is debating whether to create a new safety agency.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So as we move forward, I mean, this was the announcing of our findings today. So we'll be working with the city in the days and weeks ahead on what's next. That could be part of the conversation. But we think that any steps that the city is making to resolve race-based policing is a good step. And we know that we need a consent decree that provides that consistent oversight into the future to make sure that it continues beyond whatever change they may or may not make today or yesterday.
Again, when it comes to the U.S. Justice Department investigation, do you foresee any problems or conflicts if there are, say, dueling consent decrees, one from a federal judge and one from a state judge, or do you have a plan to work together? Have other departments had multiple consent decrees at the same time?
Yeah, so it might be helpful to just stress that this is an investigation into the Minnesota Human Rights Act. So there's no dueling jurisdictions here. This is about violations of the Minnesota Human Rights Act. We have found that the city and MPD is in violation of the Minnesota Human Rights Act, and we are moving forward with enforcement mechanisms around that, which includes a consent decree to make sure that there is no race-based policing in violation of the Minnesota Human Rights Act. Thank you.